What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica, and in each of these videos I sit down here with you guys and we discuss a different true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds fun to you, I'd say subscribe, stick around, and join me back here each week. If the combination isn't for you, I've got some links down in the description, but for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's case. I'm gonna have to ask y'all right here at the tippy top of today's video to I'm gonna just need you to bear with me today, all right? When I tell you that the research for this video fried my brain to hell and back, girl, I'm talking extra crispy 11 herbs and spices, Kentucky fried up in this old noggin after this one. I'd do it again though. I would do it 10 times over, in fact, because this case is crazy. I want to say that I'm shocked that more people haven't covered this story, but I'm also really not, because actually sourcing the information for this story, ooh, it was a commitment, bitch. This is the first case that I think I have ever researched, at least that I can remember, where every single itty bitty, teeny tiny, infinitesimal speck of information that I have to present to you here today, all of that came from me digging back through 50 years of newspaper clippings. Yeah, my newspapers.com subscription, I got a workout these past couple days. $74 well spent. It probably wouldn't have been as mentally strenuous as it was to a normal person, but because my note-taking style is violently disorganized. Girl, I spent so many hours just organizing my notes and cross-checking information and just straining my eyes to read the oldest newspaper articles. All of this to say, I'm sorry this video is a few days late, but I'm here now. Sure, my brain is just quite literally crunched up Fritos at this point. So if things get a little weird here today, a little chaotic, that's why. But beyond that, what do you say I just shut up and we go ahead and we see how this all plays out? Yeah? Without further ado, this is the story of the 1977 Seaside massacre. Okay, so Seaside, California. Formerly known as East Monterey, Seaside is a city in Monterey County, California, located near the southern end of Monterey Bay. It rests on about 9 square miles of land and is located about an hour and a half south of San Jose. Currently hosting a population of just over 32,000, Seaside is known for its pristine beaches. It's a great place to go kayaking. It has great scuba diving and hang gliding. It's got fantastic restaurants and a lot of shopping and parks. Most famously, though, it hosts Fort Ord National Monument Park, which is the former site of Fort Ord Army Base, which closed in 1994. So, as you can see, truly just a beautiful city with a beautiful weather and a rich history. So, not too shabby, right? Unfortunately, though, even the most beautiful and seemingly serene places are not immune to tragedy and devastation. And sadly, tragedy and devastation are exactly what we will be discussing here today. Harold Arnold Bicknell was born in 1958 in Pacific Grove, California, to his parents, Harold David and Dolores Bicknell. Now, I wasn't able to find too much as far as really detailed information on Harold's upbringing or his family life was concerned. I do know that he was one of 6 total children born specifically to Harold David and Dolores. However, based off of his father's obituary, which stated that he had 7 total children, it would appear that Harold either had a step-sibling or a half-sibling in there somewhere as well. At any rate, though, devastatingly, one of Harold's older sisters did die shortly after her birth. So although Harold David and Dolores did have 6 children altogether, Harold only grew up with 4 of those 5 siblings. And unfortunately, for reasons that are unknown to me, be it the struggle of losing a child or something else entirely, by the time Harold was just 9 years old, his parents separated, officially divorcing sometime in 1967, which is a difficult time for any child. And 9 in particular seems like a difficult age to have your entire life just completely flipped upside down. And regretfully, the gut punches did not stop there for poor little Harold. Actually, between the ages of like 9 and 15, Harold would experience more pain and more loss in those 6-ish years than I'd imagine any child could possibly even hope to cope with. Obviously, we just talked about his parents' divorce, which is undoubtedly a difficult time for anyone, but compounding that, just 2 years later, when Harold was 11, his mother Dolores, she drowned under suspicious circumstances while out in Carmel Valley with her brother. Yeah, evidently, what happened was, I guess Dolores was visiting her brother John. This is January 1969, by the way. And at some point during this visit, the two of them decided that they wanted to head over to Robinson Creek because they wanted to check out some flooding that I guess had been happening in that area during the time. But then on the way to the creek, which this is according to John, by the way, Dolores' brother, he claimed that on their way to the creek, Dolores asked him to pull over because she felt as though he'd been drinking too much that day to be driving. Now, to me, that seems like something she probably would have noticed prior to getting in the car at all, but again, this is according to John. This is what he later went on to tell police. So he pulls over to, I guess, sober up at Dolores's behest. And then it was while they were sitting there just idly on the side of the road, some unidentified rapscallion ambushed them, and he demanded they give him their loot. So I guess this was like some sort of robbery attempt. And it was at that point, John claimed, that he and his sister both jumped out of the car and they started running away from this mystery assailant, only to fall into the now raging creek. Lucky for John, he was able to pull himself out of the water and get to safety relatively quickly. However, poor Dolores, she was swept away in this flooding. And I'm not sure if John attempted at all to find her, because apparently when police found him, he was soaking wet and passed out back in the car. So that was weird. And then sadly, 39-year-old Dolores' body was found a few days later, wedged in some debris near the Carmel River Bridge. And obviously this was devastating to Harold and his siblings. I mean, they were probably still reeling from their parents' divorce in general. And now all of a sudden, they just don't even have a mom anymore. I mean, talk about having your entire world completely fucking rocked. But what's really weird about Dolores' death overall, like, aside from her brother's entire story of how the whole thing played out. But what's spooky is that Harold and his sister Diana later claimed that they had this really ominous feeling when their mother had left in the first place just to go and visit their uncle. Now, they were still pretty young when all this went down, so they couldn't really put their finger on what the feeling was. But later as adults, they felt as though they had, like, I don't know, oh God, what's the word I'm looking for? Not a premonition, but I don't know, I guess like a foreboding feeling that something bad was going to happen to their mother on that trip. And whether you think they really predicted that or whether you think it's just like a really crazy coincidence, one thing is for sure, and that is that those kids had now suffered 2 completely devastating, life-altering experiences, all within the span of just like 24 months. Now, Harold David, which, if you'll remember, is Harold's dad. Sorry, I know it's confusing that they're both named Harold. That's why I keep referring to the dad by his first and middle name rather than just calling him Harold. You want to really have your brain just leak out your ears. Guess what Harold's brother's name was? You guessed it, Harold.
You're confusing me!
Anyway, sorry, I was saying, Harold David did go on to remarry that very same year, 1969, the same year that Dolores died. And while I couldn't find anything specifically that detailed how the children felt about their father's new marriage or how they felt about their new stepmother, no matter what, I think we can all hypothesize that it was likely a difficult transition one way or another. Even if their new stepmom was the nicest lady in the entire world, she's still not their mom. And to top it off, she's now joining their family at an incredibly difficult and highly emotional time. Regardless of how the story goes on to play out, at this point in time, I genuinely feel bad for Harold and his siblings and everything that they've been going through. And believe it or not, the hits they're going to just keep on coming. 4 years later, after Harold David had remarried, so 5 years after Dolores had died, Harold David then died in a 2-alarm house fire. Yeah, get this shit. So December 19th, 1973, apparently Harold David fell asleep on his couch while smoking a cigarette, and the cigarette fell onto the couch, and then the couch caught on fire. That's not even the crazy part though, because judging by a smoldering couch cushion that fire personnel actually found outside of his home, it is actually theorized that Harold David woke up when the fire started. He saw that the point of origin was his couch cushion, and I guess he just threw it out the window. He threw a burning couch cushion out the window, and then he just laid back down and went right back to sleep. Like, that is the level of unbothered I aspire to be. Actually, you know what? Maybe not, because in this instance, it did not pan out well for old Harold David. Yeah, I guess he fell back asleep pretty quick, and somehow he didn't realize that the fire on his couch, it had not been completely extinguished. Therefore, the flames eventually did kick back up, and this time Harold David was not so lucky. Sadly, he did end up dying in that fire in his home that morning. He was only 44 years old. Now, despite my strenuous research attempts, I have absolutely no idea where the kids were or where Karen was when all of this went down. All I know is that Harold David was the only one to be hurt in this fire, but that it actually did get large enough to warrant evacuation of a nearby apartment complex. So now Harold, who's 14, 15 at this point, he's now lost his family dynamic with his parents' divorce. He lost his mother tragically. He lost his father tragically. He's literally an orphan at this point. I mean, I think we can all agree that that is a lot for any one child to experience in such a short time frame. So understandably, Harold was not the most well-adjusted person. Quite the opposite, actually. When described by those who knew him, Harold was often referred to as a loner. He was said to be ill-tempered, he was egotistical, he was argumentative. I did see some reports that described him as intelligent. However, it does not appear that that translated at all to Harold's actual academic performance. Ooh, and then this next thing, it's probably one of my biggest pet peeves. Harold dropped out of high school 2 months before graduation. Listen, I am not judging anyone for potentially dropping out of high school. Sure, I think it's a disservice to yourself to do so, but I've also never been in a position that might lend me to feeling like dropping out was my only option. So of course, I try to reserve my judgments on that which I have not yet lived. That said though, how are you gonna drop out with 2 months left? You've made it almost the whole way. Just stick it out for the next 8 weeks and then it's behind you forever. I will never be able to wrap my mind around it when people throw in the towel at the very end of their senior year. Like, dude, you're there. Again, I've never lived it, so perhaps it's ignorant of me to pass judgment, but to go through 99.9999999% of it just to give up at the last little stretch, that is wild to me. Now, I don't know the exact circumstances surrounding Harold's departure from school, but from what I could gather, it kind of just seems like he was ready to be out and to be an adult. Once he left school, it looks like he picked up some odd jobs working in construction. He was even engaged to be married at one point. I mean, he'd been orphaned for 3 years by this point, so it's very likely that he just felt ready to actually live as the adult that he likely felt like for years at that point. Bummer for Harold, though. None of this really seems to have played out the way that he was hoping it would, or the way that he was planning for it to. And while I can't say for sure, because I wasn't there, it kind of seems like the beginning of Harold's descent into absolute madness. It sort of seems like it was precipitated by the end of his engagement. Harold was madly in love with his fiancée, Rose Havlicek. I mean, obviously, given their engagement, Harold had every intention of spending the rest of his life with her. So when one day, just completely out of the blue, Rose decided to call their wedding, engagement, and relationship off, well, this was beyond devastating to Harold. Truly, it doesn't seem as though he ever got over Rose. It doesn't seem like he ever moved on from her. Actually, it kind of seemed like he always held on to some sort of hope that the two of them would somehow find their way back together. And, had the next few months of Harold's life played out differently, who's to say that that wouldn't have happened? Unfortunately, though, it wouldn't be the case. And it all came down to a young lady named Terry Milligan. Teresa Marie Milligan, known as Terry to those closest to her, was born sometime in the early 60s. Based on math, I believe she was born in 1963, but no matter how far or wide I searched, and believe me, I looked, but I simply could not find an exact date of birth for young Miss Terry. And girl, when I say young, I mean young. At the time our story takes place, Terry was just 14 years old. And unfortunately, yes, this is heading exactly where you think it is. From what I could gather, it appears as though Terry was an only child. Again, she was born in the early 60s to her incredibly dysfunctional parents, Marcella and Franklin Milligan. And because Marcella and Franklin had so many issues, sadly, Terry grew up in a very chaotic and very traumatizing environment. Not only was Franklin a raging alcoholic, which, speaking from experience, can be very traumatizing for a child in and of itself. However, on top of being a drunk, Franklin was also incredibly violent and incredibly abusive towards Marcella. By Marcella's own statements, following these knockdown, drag-out fights that she and Franklin would have, Terry would often be tasked with aiding her unconscious mother. Just absolutely awful and undoubtedly very damaging. And as if that wasn't bad enough, on top of everything else that was going on within her nuclear family unit, Terry was also sexually molested by a family friend as a child. So immediately, we're not starting off on a very strong foot. Genuinely, it seems like Terry was set up for failure right from the very beginning. And things got so much worse progressively within her home that for a while, she actually ended up in foster care. So suffice it to say that by the time her teenage years rolled around and by the time our story takes place, Terry was just horribly depressed. And unfortunately, it was in this incredibly fragile and incredibly vulnerable state. This is when Terry Milligan crossed paths with Harold Bicknell. Now, I have absolutely no idea how the two first came to know one another. That was something I was unable to find clarification on. However, what I can tell you is that, according to Harold, he had no intentions with Terry when he met her other than to be a support system for her. He claims that he only intended to be her friend and to help her get through her family problems. But over time, surprise, surprise, one thing led to another, and Terry and Harold's once platonic friendship eventually did cross the boundary over into a sexual relationship. Mind you, Harold is 19 right now in comparison to Terry's 14. Gross. Gross and illegal, obviously, but clearly that doesn't matter to Harold. Now, personally, I don't believe that Harold didn't have any interest in Terry from the start, because I'm sorry, but 19-year-old men simply do not hang out with 14-year-old girls out of benevolence and sympathy. Sorry, I just don't buy it. Now, if he had said that he didn't intend for he and Terry to become anything serious, that I can buy. I think he just viewed Terry as someone to pass his time with until Rose eventually, hopefully, came back around to him. I think he figured that when that happened, he could drop Terry like she was nothing. I mean, he'd have a great excuse because they obviously legally couldn't be anything real. So he could dump her and then he could ride off into the sunset with Rose, just as he had always imagined things would turn out for him. That is until late July, when all those hopes and dreams once again came crashing down around Harold, when Terry found out that she was pregnant. Yeah. Uh-oh. Now, obviously, this is less than ideal for a myriad of reasons. Of course, there's the fact that these two legally shouldn't even be together. Let's not forget that little tidbit. But beyond that, Terry's only 14. She has a horrible family life. She has virtually no support. Harold also has no parents to help him through his transition into fatherhood, so he's got no support either. He's barely supporting himself alone at this point on his construction salary. So again, this is just really not an ideal situation to be bringing a helpless little baby into. Yet, still, none of these things were what Harold was actually worried about when it came to finding out that Terry was pregnant. No, money, age, lack of family support, readiness, that all paled in comparison to him. All he cared about was the thought of what Rose might think if she found out. Yeah, that was his main concern. He found out he was going to be a father, and the only thing he cared about was what his ex-fiancée might do or say if she found out that he was not only living with, but also dating this literal child, and now he's knocked her up on top of it. I mean, I guess I get it, because something tells me if there was any chance that he and Rose might have gotten back together someday, finding out that he'd impregnated a child through statutory rape right after they separated, yeah, I'm thinking that would have closed the door for good between Miss Havlicek and Mr. Bicknell. And honestly, it seems like Harold must have felt the same way, because he desperately did everything in his power to keep his relationship with Terry, as well as their bun in the oven, like a big ass secret. And dude, I cannot imagine being Terry in this situation. You're pregnant, you're scared, you can't possibly be prepared for this. And now on top of all of that, this man that took advantage of you and knocked you up in the first place wants to keep you and your baby a secret in hopes of someday winning his ex-girlfriend back. I mean, we are talking just like a whole ass mess. Not to mention, super unrealistic. Seaside is an incredibly small and incredibly tight-knit community. And if there is one thing that teenage girls are not known for, it's their discretion and their ability to keep secrets. So despite Harold's wishes, eventually word did start to spread through this quiet little town that he and Terry were living together and that they were with child. And as if that wasn't bad enough for Harold, to add insult to injury, it would actually end up being his very own cousin that would ultimately give him the ultimatum that made him snap. Tell Rose what he had done, or she would. Laureen Renee Ferguson, known to her friends and family as Renee, at the time our story takes place, was just 15 years old. And like basically everyone else we've discussed so far, she didn't have the best upbringing in the world. Now, I don't have too many details, unfortunately, about what exactly was so difficult for Renee within her family's home, but what I do know is that by 15, Renee was living with her grandma Josephine, her aunt Suzanne, and her cousin Rachel, all in her grandma's tiny little bungalow-style apartment, which was located at 555 C Sonoma Street. And actually, at the time, Grandma Josephine had only been back living in Seaside for, I think, a little over a year. Don't get me wrong, she lived in Seaside for most of her life. However, when Suzanne began having marital issues, Josephine actually moved out to Kansas for a bit to try to help support her daughter. Then, when Suzanne decided to separate from her husband, she, her daughter, and Josephine all ended up moving back to Seaside and into the little cottage on Sonoma Street. Then, I'd imagine shortly after their return was when Renee moved in, after she had spent some time in foster care. So Renee was living with these extended family members of hers. She was attending a continuation school in Marina La Vida, and she was working part-time at Point Lobos State Reserve. Basically, it seems like, despite whatever challenges her home life had thrown at her over the years, from what I could tell, it does seem like Renee was trying desperately to keep herself on track so that she could set herself up for a decent future. However, sadly, those dreams and aspirations, they would never come to fruition. And actually, that sadly brings us to the tragic events of August 9th, 1977. All right, buckle in, y'all. It's about to get wild. Now, I know I've already thrown a ton of names at you so far. I'm doing my best to keep things digestible and to keep things as easy to follow as possible, but the fact of the case is that there's 8 people in this story. So far, we've been introduced to 6 of them, which leaves us with 2 introductions left. Don't worry, I got a whole family tree walkthrough that I'm going to show you here in a second. First, though, allow me to introduce you to Renee's sister, Raylene Ferguson, who was just 14 years old at the time our story takes place. Now, while Renee had managed to claw her way out of her nuclear family's toxic environment, Raylene, on the other hand, was still living at home with she and Renee's mother, Lorraine's boyfriend, Marvin Thiel, as well as their other sister, Colleen, and their brother, Alan. And then, on the night in question, which, if you'll remember, is Tuesday, August 9th, 1977, Raylene was actually planning to have a sleepover at the home of her friend, 15-year-old Karen Kirby. And Karen, who is in fact the 8th person in our story today, at the time was a high school freshman, described by her mother as the sweetest and kindest girl who ever lived. A good girl who never, ever got in trouble. Well, that is, till this next thing rolls around, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So, as promised, here's a breakdown that might hopefully make things easier to visualize, because obviously, like I said, I just threw a crap load of names at you. So obviously we know Harold, but up here, up at the top of the family tree, we've got Josephine. She is both Harold's grandmother as well as Renee and Raylene's grandmother. And obviously at the time our story takes place, we know that Renee was living with her grandmother. Then moving down a generation, we've got Josephine's children. We've got Dolores, which is Harold's mother. We have Lorraine, which is Renee and Raylene's mother. She's not really in the story too much. She's just on here mainly to illustrate Raylene and Renee's relationship to Josephine. And then finally for this row, we have Suzanne, who is also Josephine's daughter. Obviously that makes her Harold and Renee and Raylene's aunt. She is also currently living with Renee and Josephine with her daughter Rachel while she's separated from her husband. So Rachel is Suzanne's daughter, Josephine's granddaughter, and Harold, Renee, and Raylene's cousin. And then to reiterate one final time, all living together in the little cottage on Sonoma was Josephine, Renee, Suzanne, and Rachel. Then when it comes to non-related people in this story, Harold was dating / knocked up Terry, who was friends with Karen, who was friends with Raylene. Hopefully now you're starting to see why my brain has been rendered to applesauce after researching this case. Nevertheless, when we last left off prior to introductions and genealogy, Renee had threatened Harold with telling Rose that he was dating / had knocked up Terry. And obviously this was the absolute worst thing in the world that she could have done to him, because as previously mentioned, nothing on earth meant more to Harold than potentially winning Rose back someday. So rather than sit back and be the man that he so desperately believed he already was, an adult that could realize through introspection that he was solely to blame in this situation, take accountability for the fact that he had no one to blame other than himself for his inability to keep it in his pants. No. He did not even slightly come to that conclusion. Instead, he decided that his best course of action was to head over to his grandma's house and to have a little chat with his dear, sweet cousin. So he and Terry hopped in the car and off to Sonoma Street they went. Meanwhile, over at Karen's house, she and Raylene, they're hanging out. It's super low key. It's just your average run-of-the-mill sleepover. When all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Karen suggests that maybe they should head over to Raylene's grandma's house so that they can hang out with Renee. Which doesn't sound like anything at first until you think about the fact that it's got to be pushing 9 p.m. at this point, because the 4 Sonoma Street residents, Josephine, Renee, Suzanne, and Rachel, they had all attended an evening sermon at Seaside's Assembly of God church that night. Josephine had been going to that church for like 20 plus years, and she almost never missed a sermon. And if memory serves me correctly, this sermon didn't even wrap up until like later on in the evening. So like 8:30? Not to mention the fact that after the sermon had ended, Josephine stopped for a bit to talk to Pastor Milligan about a completely separate event that the church was supposed to be hosting the following day. So Wednesday, August 10th. I guess Josephine and the girls were also supposed to come and help out with that event, so she had stopped to talk to the pastor just to like hammer out a few details. Basically, all this to say that for Raylene to even think that the 4 of them would be home, again, it had to be pushing 9 o'clock at that point. But either way, I guess Raylene was totally down to go and to visit her sister, so the two headed out of Karen's house and off they too went to Sonoma Street. Karen and Raylene did ultimately make it to the cottage on Sonoma first. However, Harold and Terry were not far behind them. Actually, I think during Raylene's later testimony, she stated that Harold and Terry showed up just as she and Karen were about to knock on the door. And understandably, Raylene was very surprised to see her cousin Harold and his girlfriend Terry walking up to the house just as she and Karen arrived. For like the 50th time, it was after 9 p.m. at this point. So the idea that 4 separate impromptu visitors all decided to drop by that night randomly at the same time. Girl, if I was Josephine, I'd be pissed. I am half her age, and nobody better show up at my house unannounced past 9 p.m. But I guess since they were family, nobody really thought anything of it. But as soon as Harold and Terry, Raylene and Karen walked through that door, almost instantly, all hell broke loose. Remember, Harold's not there for leisure. This isn't just an innocent, friendly visit. Renee is threatening to ruin his life, and he's here to stop her from doing so. And he plans to do that by any means necessary. So within minutes of Harold and Renee being in the same room together. I guess they'd gone back to Renee's room to talk, but very quickly that conversation escalated into a fight. I mean, I don't know what Harold was expecting out of this conversation, but Renee was steadfast. She was absolutely not backing down. She stuck to her guns, and she once again told Harold that if he did not come clean to Rose about Terry and about the baby, she was going to do it for him. And actually this time she went as far as to tell him that he owed her for even giving him the chance to come clean on his own. And I mean, I guess she certainly didn't have to do that for him, but I don't think Harold was even listening to Renee anymore. By this point, he was just so unbelievably furious. Who did Renee think she was, threatening to rob him of the one thing that he cared about more than anything in the world? Something he had already lost, mind you. Remember, Rose already broke up with him. So really all he's fighting for is to keep alive the possibility that perhaps, maybe someday she might consider taking him back. Like, grow the fuck up and move on. Good God. But Harold couldn't, and no one was going to stand between him and his hypothetical future with Rose. Not even his own family. And so, acting on sheer desperation, Harold reached down to his side and he grabbed the bone-handled hunting knife that he always kept on him. He grabbed it and he brandished it at Renee. Now, unfortunately, from this point on, the events that transpired through the rest of this evening, there's not really any way to know exactly how it all played out. The events I'm going to walk you through here right now, they've even been piecemealed and fucking Jenga'd together to the best of my ability through different reportings and different testimonies and things I was able to come across. So if by chance while you're listening, you're like, oh, that doesn't totally make sense, or I don't understand how blank happened, join the club, because I don't fully grasp the exact chain of events from that night either. I do know for a fact, though, that after pulling his knife on Renee, Harold bound and gagged his cousin with a bra and a towel before he mercilessly stabbed her to death right on her very own bed. Her autopsy would later show that she was stabbed between 20 and 30 times, sustaining wounds to her chest, neck, back, and shoulders. More than one of her wounds alone would have been fatal, and judging by the appearance of some of the stab wounds, it was also believed that Renee was stabbed multiple times after she had already succumbed to her other injuries. Now, according to Terry, she had no idea what was going on back in that room where Harold and Renee were talking. Actually, she claimed she only went back into the room when she heard the yelling start, and by that point, Harold had already killed Renee. And then, still according to her statement, that is when she blacked out. She claims that she does not remember a thing about the rest of the evening, which is wild, but I'll let you decide for yourself as the story continues. As far as Raylene and Karen were concerned, at that point, I think they were both just still out in the main area of the house. But you have to think that by this time, things have gotten pretty loud in the back bedroom. I mean, Harold literally just attacked and murdered Renee, like feet from where his grandmother and his aunt were sleeping. And I actually believe it was Suzanne who came out of her room first to try to figure out what the hell all the commotion was. I mean, poor thing, she's got a 6-year-old that she's trying to keep asleep, so I bet she was all kinds of pissed when all of a sudden everybody started screaming, seemingly out of the blue. She bust out of her room and pushed her way into Renee's room, and completely unexpectedly, she walked in to find her nephew and his girlfriend standing over the dead body of her niece. Can you imagine? The room was covered in blood. Renee was clearly gone at this point, and Harold was clearly responsible. Suzanne was horrified. She tried to push past Terry to get back out of the room and to get to her daughter, but devastatingly, Harold and Terry caught her and they forced her into the kitchen at knife point. And while obviously I feel for every single victim that was in that house that night, I cannot even imagine what it must have felt like to be Suzanne in that moment. Just to know that Harold has killed your niece, and to know that your daughter is sleeping in the other room, and to not be able to get to her and to save her, or to save yourself. Oh, it makes me physically fucking ill to even try to imagine that situation. Like, I literally cannot do it. My brain will not let me get there. So obviously at this point, Raylene and Karen, they can see now, like shit is popping all the way off. I'm not exactly sure what Karen did upon seeing that Harold and Terry were now taking hostages, but I do know that eventually Raylene ended up standing alone outside of the kitchen, just cowering in fear. And actually she was standing in that hallway when Grandma Josephine came out of her room and started walking towards the kitchen. I'm sure she too was trying to find out what in the ever ever-loving fuck was going on in her house. Why the hell everyone was screaming and yelling and being so loud. According to Raylene, she did try to stop her grandma from going in the kitchen. She tried to tell her to turn around and to run, but Josephine didn't listen. She simply did not understand why her granddaughter would be telling her not to go in her own kitchen. And devastatingly, by the time it became clear to her, it was too late. Now, both brandishing knives, Harold and Terry demanded that Josephine join Suzanne at knife point in the kitchen. And this next part is probably the hardest part. Once Harold was sure that Suzanne and Josephine were captive in the kitchen like he wanted, that is when he made his way to Suzanne's bedroom, and he drug poor, sweet, innocent Rachel into the kitchen to join her terrified mother and grandmother. And once they had the remaining living residents of 555 C Sonoma all confined in the kitchen, systematically, one by one, Terry and Harold slaughtered them without hesitation and certainly without mercy. Later, Harold would go on to confess to stabbing both Suzanne and Rachel. However, he would forever adamantly deny having anything to do with the death of his grandmother. And honestly, I don't think there's really any way for us to ever know who exactly stabbed whom that night, because everyone who was lucky enough to walk out of that nightmare with their life still intact, they've all given such vastly different stories compared to everyone else. So I just don't think it's likely that anyone will ever know exactly what happened that night or who exactly killed who, even with eyewitnesses present. I mean, I'm not sure what Karen's story was, but Raylene was cowering outside the kitchen the whole time. She claimed that she only looked in to see what was going on a couple of times and very quickly. So her recollection of the evening, it's disjointed at best. All I can tell you is that based on the autopsies of Josephine, Suzanne, and Rachel, their deaths were absolutely savage. They were barbaric and they were brutal, regardless of who specifically was responsible for stabbing whom. Josephine Smith was ultimately stabbed 16 times, mostly in the chest, and beyond her fatal wounds, she was also found to have sustained trauma to her face, assumably from a fist. Suzanne Harris was stabbed over 30 times, with her fatal wound having been to her heart. She was covered in defensive wounds, mostly on her legs, which indicated that she was fighting and kicking at her attacker in an effort to save her and undoubtedly her daughter's lives. And finally, Rachel Harris, she was stabbed 40 times, just all over her poor, innocent little body. She too was absolutely covered in defensive wounds, indicating that she too fought desperately for her life before she succumbed to her injuries. And when the bodies were discovered, she was found clinging to her mother's legs. Yeah, it's a lot. Once the massacre had ended and an eerie quiet had fallen over the cottage, Harold instructed Raylene and Karen to clean up what they could, while he and Terry gathered whatever evidence they thought they might want to dispose of. Oh, and I believe they also took whatever money they could scrounge up from Josephine, Renee, and Suzanne's purses. Soup's classy, guys. Just very demure. Once Harold and Terry felt as though they had done all that they could and that it was time to clear out, that is when Raylene remembers being struck in the back of the head before everything then went black. The next thing she remembered was waking up the next day back at Karen's, and as she came to and the memories from the night before started to come back to her, Raylene genuinely could not remember if what she had experienced was real or if it had been a bad dream. And later, when Karen woke up and Raylene tried to tell her, like, damn, I had a really bad dream, Karen was like, cool, I don't want to hear about it. And then, I guess because Karen didn't say anything for the rest of the day about what had happened at her grandma's the previous night, Raylene genuinely began to believe that everything that had happened, it was like she repressed it almost. Like her brain wouldn't let her believe that it was real. Instead of attempting to make sense of everything, she convinced herself that it was all just a terrible, horrible, awful dream. However, devastatingly, all too soon, what had happened that night would come to light, and Raylene and the rest of Seaside would be forced to face this just unspeakable horror. But before we get into that, I'm going to take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, the quadruple murder of Raylene, Josephine, Suzanne, and Rachel, it absolutely rocks the town of Seaside, California. Don't go nowhere. All right, so we're back, and just before our break, obviously, we know that Harold and Terry had just committed what would eventually be dubbed the worst mass murder in Monterey Peninsula history. And that was, of course, before then enlisting the help of Raylene and Karen to clean up the scene. And horrifyingly, following Harold and Terry and Karen lugging an unconscious Raylene out of that house, no one else would be there to discover the bodies of Josephine, Renee, Suzanne, and Rachel for the next 30 plus hours. I know I mentioned earlier that Josephine and the girls were meant to help out at a church event the following day, so Wednesday, August 10th, and you'd think that them not showing up to the event would have raised some red flags because it was absolutely not like any of them to ever miss a church event, let alone one that they were set to help out at. But unfortunately, Pastor Milligan stated later that he just got so busy himself working the event that while he did notice that Josephine and the girls never showed up, he really never got the chance to follow up with them until after their bodies had already been discovered. So while you would have assumed it would have been them missing the church event, the actual catalyst for the welfare check that brought the tragedy on Sonoma Street to light was when Renee missed her shift at work the evening of August 10th. Renee was a very responsible young lady, and she took her commitments very seriously. She was not the type of person to not show up for work, at least not without letting someone know or calling someone first. So when she didn't show up and her coworkers heard nothing from her, they immediately started trying to reach out to some of her family members to make sure that everything was okay. The problem with that, though, was that since Renee didn't live with, her nuclear family, it took a ton of phone calls to different people, and then those people making different phone calls to other people before the information that Renee was unaccounted for actually finally made it back to her mother. And I think if I'm remembering correctly, by the time Lorraine got the phone call, it was 3 a.m. on Thursday, August 11th. And as I'm sure you can understand, hearing that Renee had not shown up for work and that no one could get a hold of her, well, I'm sure it didn't give Lorraine the warmest of fuzzies, you know? Sure, Renee might not have lived with her, but that was still her daughter. She still loved her. She still worried about her. So, given that her boyfriend Marvin was going to be heading out of the house in just a couple of hours to head to work, she asked him if he would please swing by Josephine's place just to make sure that everything was okay with Renee. Little did they know, though, that things were far from okay. According to newspaper articles from the days following the discovery of the bodies, it looks like Marvin got to the house sometime right around 5:30 in the morning. Like I said, he had been on his way to work when he had stopped by. And at first, he didn't really feel like there was anything to worry about. He kind of felt okay about everything. The lights were on, the dogs were barking as he approached the front door, so for the most part, things seemed pretty, status quo. However, when he received no answer at the door as he knocked and knocked and knocked, well, gradually his confidence in the situation, it began to waver. And obviously, he didn't want to leave the house without any answers for Lorraine. So rather than just throwing in the towel there, instead, Marvin made his way around the side of the house to a window that looked like it had a light on. Obviously, this wasn't an ideal scenario. He didn't want to scare any of the girls by just, popping up in the window like a creep. But again, none of the circumstances that we're in right now are ideal, you know? So he creeps around back, he peers through the window, and immediately his heart sank. And that is because the window that he happened to look in, it ended up being Renee's window. And right there, in his view, lie the body of his girlfriend's daughter. She was face down on her bed, hands bound behind her back, and she was absolutely covered in blood. And that right there, that was all Marvin needed to see. Obviously, he knew immediately after looking in that window that he was in way over his head and that he needed immediate help. He was absolutely terrified. So he hightailed it the fuck up out of there. He hopped in his car and he drove himself to the nearest place that he thought might have a phone that he could use. I think I read it was a Jack-in-the-Box. Frustratingly though, the Jack-in-the-Box, either they didn't have a phone or they wouldn't let Marvin use the phone, but for whatever reason, Marvin ended up having to go from the Jack-in-the-Box across the street to a 7-Eleven, where thankfully, rather than having to call 911, he actually ended up running straight into a police officer. He frantically began trying to explain to this officer, Officer Subtle, I believe. He just began immediately verbal diarrheaing everything that he had seen at the house, and he was begging him to come back with him and to help him see what was going on. And of course, hearing the terror in Marvin's voice, Officer Subtle agreed to accompany him back to the house. Once they were there, he too knocked on the door before having Marvin then take him around the side of the house to show him what he had seen. And once Officer Subtle saw Renee's body, he immediately ripped the window screen off of her window, and he attempted to gain entry to the house through Renee's bedroom. Unfortunately, though, the window was locked, so with Marvin's permission, Officer Subtle then looped back around to the front door, which he proceeded to kick in order to make his way into the home. And knowing how already horrified Marvin was by what he had seen through Renee's window, I can't even begin to imagine how he felt when he walked into the kitchen and he saw the 3 additional bodies that had been absolutely massacred in that home. As soon as Officer Subtle saw all the blood and all of the bodies, he did try to stop Marvin from proceeding any further into the house, to try to protect him from this trauma. And that's not even mentioning that he needed to preserve any potential evidence that would need to be collected from the scene. Sadly, though, even though he did exactly as he was told, exactly when he was told, it didn't matter. Marvin had already seen more than he could have ever imagined, later stating in an interview, quote, "I don't ever want to see anything like that again. It about made me sick. I saw that itty bitty baby, eyes wide open, and it was the worst thing I had ever seen." Marvin actually ended up collapsing outside of the house by Officer Suttle's car after he had seen what he had seen. Truly, what these people went through in that house, it was unfathomable. There were pools of blood everywhere in that house. There was blood from one end of the kitchen to the other. There was blood on the walls, on the furniture, the cabinets, the appliances. I mean, we already talked about the sheer brutality that each of the victims had faced. But to put it more into perspective, one article I saw said something like a butchery was too light of a word to describe this scene. It was so bad, in fact, that after backup had arrived on the scene, more than a few of the officers got sick at the scene because of how bad it was. These women and these children had been stabbed cumulatively over 100 times. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they were then left to sit and rot in that house for almost 2 days in the California summer heat. It was awful. Josephine, Renee, Susan, and Rachel's bodies were ultimately removed from the home, and they were transported to Seaside Mortuary, where they underwent autopsies as well as formal identification. And given that this was the 70s, as in the decade before DNA science was ever used in a criminal investigation, this meant that the bodies, they had to be identified the old-fashioned way, as in by someone who knew them, which is probably the most horrific thing a person could ever have to go through. I cannot even imagine having to stomach seeing my loved one in a state like that. There is just no way that that is not going to stick with you forever. Thankfully, though, as word started to spread throughout Seaside about what had happened and who these victims were believed to be, Pastor Milligan actually volunteered to go to the mortuary himself to identify the bodies so that he could spare the family members that pain. And while we can all agree that that was an incredibly admirable thing for Pastor Milligan to do, one thing that it wasn't was easy. In a later interview, when speaking about the moment that he saw the bodies, Pastor Milligan stated, quote, "I'm usually pretty collected. I've seen bodies strewn all over the street and mangled, but this was the first time in my life I had to hang on to the wall. I have never seen anything so grisly and so inhumane in my life." Josephine, Renee, Susan, and Rachel were laid to rest exactly 1 week after their lives were brutally taken from them. They were jointly celebrated in a combined service officiated by Pastor Milligan at Seaside Assembly of God Church, a place where all four of them had come to be so well known and so well loved. Family, friends, fellow churchgoers, over 350 people from the community showed up that day to mourn and to honor and to grieve these four devastating losses. But what's really eerie about this is that not a single one of these people knew that sitting there in that church that day, they themselves were sitting in the presence of the very person responsible for their grief. Harold had attended numerous family gatherings following the discovery of the massacre on Sonoma Street, and looking back, members of his family would later recall that he showed very little, if any, grief or sadness. At the time, I don't know that anyone really thought all that much of it. I mean, we know that Harold had been through tragedy after tragedy after tragedy by this point. So that, coupled with the fact that he's always been kind of a loner, always kind of been the strong, silent type, typically holding in grief, it all kind of seemed normal at first. Yeah, it wouldn't be until later, when the truth came out, that everyone realized just how disturbing and how cruel his lack of emotion truly was. And while these hundreds of people sat in this church and they mourned his family because of what he himself had done, Harold just sat there, silently, stoically, full well knowing that he was responsible for every bit of pain and confusion in that room. And my good God, were these people confused. These victims, they were good people. They were innocent people, pillars of the community, gems of their church. So Seaside as a whole, as a community, they just could not even begin to fathom why someone would want to do this. They couldn't fathom who would want to do this. No one knew if the attack was random, if it was targeted. Was this a one-time thing? Were other residents of the town in danger? It was a very scary time. Rightfully so, this massacre put people on edge. And what certainly did not help was that the community, they were getting nothing from police. They weren't getting information. They weren't getting reassurances. Don't get me wrong, police made public statements regarding the case, but when I tell you that I have never seen anything more vague in my life, wow. Just beating around the bush and talking in circles to avoid answering questions. I mean, I understand keeping vital information close to the vest, but at the end of the day, all they really ended up doing was pissing off the residents of Seaside to the point of just brutal criticism. People were so discouraged by the lack of progress in the case that they actually started banding together and forming these citizens brigades to patrol the streets. These volunteers would get together and they would head out through the town on foot just to make sure that nothing nefarious was going on. Sort of like a really large-scale neighborhood watch. And while I do have criticisms about how police handled the case as far as the public went, I do feel like they were doing the best that they could with the case, given the resources that they had at hand. Bear in mind, this department had less than 40 officers total. So giant, monumental, just record-breaking case compared to an itty-bitty investigation team. And these people, they were fighting an uphill battle. I will tell you what. There was no clear motive. Burglary, robbery, and sexual assault, they were all ruled out pretty much immediately. There were no signs of forced entry. There were no identifiable suspicious fingerprints. The victims' wounds seemed like they had been caused by multiple different weapons. The killers had obviously tried to clean up, albeit poorly. Basically, all they were able to come up with at first was that perhaps the victims knew their killers, given the lack of forced entry and the undeniable overkill that was present at the scene. And beyond that, all they were able to hypothesize was that maybe there might have been more than one killer. And that was based on the hundreds of different sized bloody footprints that had been left throughout the entirety of the house. Other than that, though, They didn't have shit. They talked to neighbors, they talked to family and friends, they talked to friends of friends. I think overall they interviewed something like 500 people in the early days of the investigation. And after each and every interview, they walked away just as lost and confused as they'd been going into it. Sure, they had some evidence. They took a broom from the scene because it had been lying across the victims. They took a mop. They took a diary, a watch, a couple of towels, and they took the 3 eldest victims' wallets. Oh, and they also took one of the kitchen cabinet doors from the house because it had a very noticeable gouge taken out of it. And investigators believed that this might help them with comparisons if or when they ever found one of the murder weapons. And that might sound like a good start, but the problem with this evidence was that either it didn't make sense or they didn't have anything to compare it to. They didn't have a weapon to compare to the gouge in the cabinet door. They didn't have footprints to compare to the footprints at the scene. They were so desperate to hopefully find a suspect whose footprints matched the ones they'd pulled from the scene that during every interview they did, they had every single person take their shoes off, step into some paint, and then walk down this stretch of like brown butcher paper. Time after time after time, they did this. And time after time after time, the results did not match the ones that they had taken from the house. They even eventually offered a cash reward to the public for any tips that would help them to solve this case. They were really just that desperate. For close to 2 months, police ran around Seaside, following leads, looking for clues, and essentially just chasing their tails. That is, however, until they received a phone call from just the most unlikely person. And that call was what ultimately broke this case wide open. You remember Rose Havlicek, Harold's ex-fiance? You know, the one that Harold killed his family in order to keep from finding out that he was living with / impregnated Terry. Yeah, I don't know how she found out, what she heard, or what kind of psychic abilities she has, but sometime in early October, she called the Seaside Police's tip line, and she implicated Harold as well as Terry in the massacre on Sonoma Street. Talk about your full circle moment. Now, likely right now, you're wondering, like, well, why didn't they interview Harold or do footprint comparisons with him? That's a great question, and I would love to tell you. You see, that is because Harold enlisted in the Navy 5 days after the murders. Yeah, he was out of Seaside and off to basic training in San Diego within, I think, like 3 weeks. Now, that's not to say that police didn't speak with Harold or even that he didn't stick out a bit during his interview. Police did speak to Harold, and he definitely did stick out to them during some of those early interviews. 1, we know he's weird, and 2, he was known to always carry a knife on him. But given that he worked in construction and kind of had a reason to always have a knife on him, that coupled with the fact that they had absolutely nothing else on him, I don't know, I guess he kind of just fell through the cracks. But it certainly was not going to stay like that. Not if Rose had anything to do with it. No ma'am. She brought Harold just screaming back to the top of their list as soon as she made that call to the tip line. Oh, and another thing you might be wondering is, where was Raylene during all of this? Once again, great question, and once again, I would love to tell you. Remember how I told you that she woke up the morning after the murders and she had convinced herself that the whole thing was just like a terrible dream? Yeah, she never really let go of that. Well, at least at first, she didn't. Even after her mom sat she and her sister down and told them that Renee had been killed, Raylene still reacted as if this was just like brand new information to her. As if she wasn't damn near an eyewitness to the entire horrific event that night. What's really crazy though is that she and her other sister, Colleen, they had such extreme reactions to hearing about Renee's death that they had to be hospitalized briefly because they were quite literally that hysterical. And then Raylene in particular, she slept in her bedroom closet for weeks following the news of Renee's death because she was all of a sudden scared of everything. However, even after learning that Renee truly had been killed and after being hospitalized following the mental breakdown she had in response to the news, allegedly she still told herself that what she had witnessed just so happened to be a very, very coincidental dream. And while I'll be the first person to admit, hearing that, I was kind of like, come on. But later, the prosecutor theorized something that did make sense. Basically, he argued that this whole dream thing was a trauma response by Raylene. He theorized that she was so mentally incapable of dealing with what she had seen, then rather than going literally insane, her brain repressed her first-hand memory of what had happened. So in an effort to protect her, her brain really did make what happened feel more like a dream to her than something that she had truly been present for. Now that said, you're welcome to believe whatever you want. If I'm being honest, I've gone back and forth myself with what I believe multiple times while researching this case. I'm not telling you what to believe, I'm just telling you what happened. Your interpretation and what you choose to take away from it, that's all up to you, baby. Bottom line here, though, is that Raylene, she did not come forward to police until after the other three had already been arrested. Harold was arrested on October 25th, 1977. Seaside police made their way up to San Diego. They plucked him right out of basic training, and they hauled his ass almost 500 miles all the way back down to Monterey County. Now, initially, and not surprisingly, Harold did try to deny having any involvement in the deaths of his family members. Rather, he strung together multiple stories of different scenarios that were actually to blame. It started out with, I wasn't there, I have no idea what actually happened. Then it morphed into, well, maybe these people I know, maybe they put a curse on her. Until eventually it became, these two Mexican guys killed them because Renee knew too much about some drug dealing that they were doing. Truly, the creativity that Harold displayed in trying to talk himself out of going to prison, it was something. I don't know what exactly, but I do know it was something. That much is for sure. Actually, according to the prosecutor in this case, Harold's different stories were, quote, tales told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, all which signified nothing. Eventually, though, after hours and hours and hours of interrogations and hours of being interviewed, police did finally manage to get a taped confession out of Harold. Although he would go on to recant it later, because of course he would. That said, though, before he tried to bust a Yui on his confession, he did corroborate Rose's accusation of Terry's involvement, but he also introduced his own implication of Karen, which led to both girls being arrested the following day. Harold was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, and he was held on a $50,000 bond, while Karen and Terry were also charged with murder and remanded to a juvenile detention center pending their own trial. And like I said, it was after word spread about their arrests that Raylene finally decided, maybe I should, talk to somebody about what I saw. Better late than never, I guess. Nevertheless, that is how she eventually ended up finally talking to police. And actually, the fact that none of the other 3 independently brought her up or implicated her as being involved or even mentioned that she was there, personally, I feel like that does kind of corroborate her story that she was a completely innocent and completely unsuspecting bystander. I don't think that she was aware that anything violent was going to happen that night. I think she just found herself stuck in the wrong place at the wrong time. Whether you believe that she believed that what she had seen was a dream or not, whether she just was scared to speak up about the fact that she was there, whatever the case may be with that, I don't think that speaks in any way to whether or not she had any preconceived knowledge of what was going to be going on at the house that night. Because if she was involved or she knew anything major, I would have to imagine that at least one of the other 3 would have jumped at the chance to, spread out the blame, Unfortunately, though, for police, and I think I kind of mentioned this earlier, but nobody, not Raylene, not Harold, not Terry nor Karen, none of them managed to give an account of the evening that was consistent with any of the others. Now, as far as this goes with Terry, Harold, and Karen, I think their motive in this was self-preservation. I think they each likely left out the chunks that made them look the worst. But for Raylene, like I said earlier, she wasn't actually in either of the rooms where any of the murders took place. So the only tiny bits and pieces that she saw or from the couple of very few fleeting moments that she worked up enough courage to peek into the kitchen. Investigators actually ended up resorting to hypnosis to get some semblance of a full story out of Raylene. Something that they could try to piece together to figure out what had truly happened on the night of the murders. And actually, it was that story, the one that was drawn out of her through hypnosis, that she ended up testifying to while on the stand at Harold's trial. And speaking of Harold's trial, prior to it actually kicking off, his defense attorney fought tooth and nail to get the proceedings moved somewhere out of Monterey County. He argued that given the surplus of media coverage that had come out about this case since it happened, he did not believe that there was a snowball's chance in hell that his client would be able to get a fair trial if it was left to be fought in Monterey. Big fat bummer for Harold, though. After the prosecuting attorney literally tallied up the percentage of media coverage that Harold in particular had actually gotten, and after proving to the judge that that percentage was less than 1, I think it was like 1/3% or something like that, suffice it to say, motion denied. Harold's trial began in February of 1978. Again, he was being tried on 4 counts of first-degree murder, and if found guilty, he was potentially facing life in prison. Ironically, the death penalty had actually been voted back in late in the afternoon on the exact day that the bodies of Josephine, Renee, Suzanne, and Rachel had been discovered, meaning that because the crime had been committed prior to the death penalty being reinstated, Harold was not eligible to be put to death for his crimes. All in all, Harold's trial lasted for 22 days, with the jury hearing numerous testimonies that, they didn't make Harold look great. Let's just say that. They heard Marvin Thiel recount his discovery of Renee's body. They heard Officer Settle recount his discovery of the rest of the scene. They heard Coroner Paul Crossman testify to the numerous injuries the victims had all sustained. They heard inconsistent at best stories from Harold's boss about his whereabouts and his behavior following the news of his family members' deaths. They heard from a different coworker who claimed that Harold had joked with her about being the one to murder his family, because, that's hilarious. They heard from Raylene and Renee's sister, Colleen. They heard from their mother, Lorraine. Obviously, they heard from Raylene herself. They heard from Raymond Jensen with the State Department of Justice Crime Lab. He testified to the probability that the gouges in that one cabinet door that they had taken from the house. He testified that it was highly likely that those marks in the cabinet had come from Harold's bone-handled hunting knife. They heard from Dr. Louise Robbins, a physical anthropologist from the University of North Carolina, who testified to the similarities between the bloody footprints in the home and Harold's sample footprints. I think she presented a 23-page slideshow to the juries showing exactly, point by point, how she had concluded that the footprints belonged to Harold. From there, they heard from the investigator who recorded Harold's confession. Actually, the court played the confession for the jury. They heard from another inmate who had spent time with Harold in jail, who claimed that Harold had bragged to him about having committed the murders. Oh, and they also heard from Harold's sister Diana, who was called to testify regarding a drawing police had found among Harold's things that appeared to directly reference the deaths of his family members. I guess the picture was like a road at sunset, and along the road were 4 separate crosses. And then across the drawing, Harold had scrawled something like, "Death is freedom, and those who are looking for freedom have a long way to go." And although Diana claimed that Harold had drawn this picture long before the deaths of Josephine, Renee, Suzanne, and Rachel, she also testified to she and her brother's innate ability to predict death. And she bolstered this by telling the story about how they were somehow able to predict that their mom was going to die before she did. Now, when Harold was later asked about this drawing, he claimed that it referenced the crossroads he was at when it came to his relationship with Terry and the relationship he hoped to rekindle with Rose. And look, I'm no artist, but in my brain, that doesn't make any sense, but I guess art is subjective, so who am I to say what it means? What was weird, though, was when asked why the image depicted 4 crosses rather than 2, he claimed that it was for nothing more than artistic symmetry. As if there's no way to make 2 crosses symmetrical. Sure, pal. Sure. Like I said, things were not looking good for Harold. So what did he decide to do about it? Well, he decided to testify on his own behalf, of course, because, that never goes poorly. Throughout his testimony, Harold went from claiming his innocence to claiming he was brainwashed into confessing to claiming that he had multiple personalities and that it was a completely different person within him that was responsible for the murders. Tales told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, all which signified nothing. Following closing arguments, the Monterey County Superior Court jury, made up of 8 women and 4 men, deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days before returning and finding Harold guilty of all 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was subsequently sentenced to life in prison with the possibility for parole after 7 years, which in my opinion is way too light, but I wasn't there, so what do I know? Moving on from Harold, momentarily though, to Karen and Terry. Because they were both under the age of 16 at the time the murders took place, neither of them were eligible to be tried as an adult for their involvement. So that meant that their trials were held separately from Harold's, but jointly with one another in juvenile court rather than going through the adult system. And actually, the court proceedings for the girls had to be carried out under like crazy heavy security because there were actually some credible threats on Terry's life prior to the trial actually getting started. So it was closed to the public, and the courthouse and courtroom were locked down like Fort freaking Knox during the proceedings. And although the girls were being tried jointly, their attorneys had very different strategies when it came to their attempts to defend their client. On one hand, Terry's attorney argued that she should be convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, arguing her upbringing as a mitigating factor. Basically insinuating that Terry was easily manipulated by Harold and that had it not been his planning and his premeditation, Terry never would have been involved in what had happened the night of the murders. And then on the other hand, Karen's attorney went a completely different direction. He argued that Karen's involvement was no different than Raylene's involvement. He argued that Karen was just as much a victim the night of the slayings as Raylene was. He believed that she had simply found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that she had had no preemptive knowledge about the murders going in that evening. Both Raylene and Harold testified at the girls' trial, which I think began a month after Harold's. Raylene's testimony was pretty much identical to the testimony that she had given at Harold's trial, while Harold, on the other hand, shocked everyone in court by finally admitting to the fact that he himself, with his own personality, he was the one who had murdered Renee, Susan, and Rachel. For whatever reason, though, he has never and likely will never claim any responsibility for what happened to Josephine. As far as her death was concerned, Harold threw his baby mama right under the bus with that one. When asked why he had orchestrated these murders, Harold simply told the court that he believed he was killing in order to protect love.
Okay.
Ultimately, when the trial concluded, Terry was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder, while Karen was found guilty of aiding and abetting after the fact. From my understanding, Terry's second-degree murder conviction was for Renee's murder. I guess the judge truly believed that she wasn't prepared for that, but then after Renee was killed, she consciously made the decision to go with Harold and to carry out the additional 3 murders, which then resulted in her 3 first-degree murder convictions. As for Karen, most of what I could find regarding her court proceedings and such, it really all kind of seemed honestly like an afterthought. I don't think throughout the proceedings that there was really even like a shred of evidence presented against Karen, other than the testimony from Raylene and Harold that she was there. And I think that's why, at the end of the day, she ended up with such a light sentence in comparison to Harold and Terry. Ultimately, Terry was sentenced to 7 years in the California Youth Authority, while Karen was sentenced to 60 days in a private facility before she was then released back into the custody of her parents. Both Harold and Terry did go on to try to appeal their convictions, mostly based on the fact that Raylene's testimony had been the product of hypnosis, therefore they thought it was unreliable. However, the prosecution argued that, the meat and potatoes of Raylene's story had never really changed, not before nor after hypnosis. More so, they claimed that the hypnosis was used to help Raylene get through the story chronologically, all in one go, without shutting down due to trauma. In the end, both of their appeal attempts were unsuccessful, and they were both ultimately forced to serve out their designated sentences. Terry gave birth to she and Harold's baby boy in April of 1978. Of course, given that she was incarcerated at the time, full custody and rights to their son was eventually signed over to Terry's mother, and hopefully she was able to provide her grandson with a significantly better home life than she was her daughter. Lord Lord knows it was probably hard enough for that little boy to grow up without his mom, so I truly hope that he did not have to grow up in the same toxic cycle of abuse that Terry did. You know, the one that ultimately led her straight into Harold's arms and then subsequently straight into the arms of the California Youth Authority. According to her teachers and the officers, Terry was a model student and a model inmate. And actually, I believe Terry herself even said in an interview once that being incarcerated was the safest and the most stable she had ever felt. And by the time talks of release for her rolled around, everyone who knew her through the CYA, they all believed that she was more ready than anyone to re-enter the public. Conversely though, said public, they weren't so sure. There was definitely a lot of backlash from the community when rumors started to spread that Terry might be released sometime soon. Actually, they granted her some limited freedoms in October of 1982, but due to the outcry and the disapproval from the public, those freedoms were actually rescinded. And I think it took at least another full year before Terry ultimately was finally released into like a transitional type group home. Which, regretfully, my friends, does bring us back around to dusty old Harold. As previously mentioned, he was eligible for parole back as early as 83. However, thankfully, he absolutely did not get it. And actually, at the time I'm filming this, so December 2024, Harold is currently still incarcerated. He is serving his time at San Quentin Rehabilitation Center, formerly known as San Quentin State Prison. He's currently 66 years old, and he has been denied an opportunity at parole each and every time he has tried to shoot his shot. Recently, though, he was this close to getting parole. He was actually granted parole in July of 2023, but it was almost immediately rescinded by a 3-person review panel following the decision. And perhaps it's real mean or real fucked up of me to say this, but I think that's funny. You know, I appreciate that they dangled the carrot and then they snatched it away from him at the last second. I'm sorry, but this man murdered a 6-year-old girl while she clung to the legs of her mother out of terror. He murdered that girl's mother right in front of her with 0 remorse and 0 empathy. He murdered his own cousin because he was mad that she wanted him to be honest with the woman he supposedly loved. Like, get a fucking grip on your life, my dude. Ugh. Personally, I don't think he should ever get out because he's selfish, he's careless, he's clearly violent. I think that behind bars is the only suitable place for someone like Harold Bicknell. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Rest in peace to the victims in today's case. Josephine, also known throughout her church as Sister Smith, was 66 years old when her life was cruelly and viciously taken from her. She was a warm and kind and nurturing person who never knew a stranger. She had attended her church for decades. She taught Sunday school, and she was always willing to help anyone with anything they needed. She was a pillar in her community, and her presence was greatly missed for years following her death. Renee Ferguson, she was only 15 when she was killed by her very own cousin. She was smart and kind, independent and hardworking. She was a young lady who, despite being dealt a crappy hand in life, had every intention of doing all she could to achieve her dreams and to make something of herself. She was an empathetic person, an honest person, and she had a good moral character. In fact, her morals meant so much to her that she lost her life trying to stick to them. Her death completely rocked not just her family, but the entire community of Seaside, California as a whole, as did the deaths of Josephine, Suzanne, and Rachel. Suzanne was just 27 years old the night that she was killed. She was an avid churchgoer. She sang in the church choir. She participated in every event, and at every opportunity she could, she got involved and she enjoyed every minute of it. Perhaps the only thing that she was more passionate about than her faith was her duties as a mother. At the time of her death, she was actually in the process of trying to reconcile with her estranged husband, and she was trying to rebuild her family, and all because of her nephew's selfishness. She will never get the chance to do that. And all because of her cousin's selfishness, Rachel will never get any chance at life at all. She was 6 years old when her life was brutally snuffed out. She lost her life before she ever even got a chance to live it. And now, that's just it. She will never get another chance to live that life ever again. All because Harold did some dumb shit and he couldn't handle facing the consequences of his own actions. Absolutely Fucking unbelievable. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the submission form that I have linked down in the description. And if by chance you're interested in anything about today's makeup, I will also make sure to have all of the links and the information for the products I used today listed down there for you as well. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every 10 days. The date of my next video should be somewhere on the screen here for you. But if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. Until then though, stay safe and have a good week. Goodbye! Harold was madly in love with his She and her daughter and Josephine all ended up moving back to Seaside and into the little college. Oh God, I hate my life. Tragic events of August 9th, 1997. Nope. Who was just 15 years old. Nope. And Karen, who is in fact the 8th person, the day of August, she came out of her room, she bust into Renee's oh, you bitch. Heard from their mother. Slideshow to the juries. Carried out under like crazy heavy California Youth Authority sometime in October of 1892. No,